Alright, so for this child review... Oh, wait, no, wait, I can't say that. For this review of Tartaglia, I will first check out his Ascension stats followed by his skill review, as well as clarifying some details from the info that we got before the patch was released. Then I'll look over at his constellations and see if like his first few constellations are worth getting or whether it's like a game changer or anything. So the first thing I did after pulling Tartaglia was to get his level up to 80. Then I equipped him with some of my better gear, and just to show his stats for reference, he has about almost 2k attack, and he also has 57.1% crit rate and almost 100% crit damage. His hydro damage bonus is currently sitting at 54.4%, and his Ascension stat is confirmed to be hydro damage bonus. It seems that it's actually different from what we saw previously because before this patch, it was stated that he would get crit rate on his Ascension. This is actually good because bow users don't really have any means to get high elemental damage bonuses, but for crit rate, you can just get them from your substats or even from weapons like the Skyward Harp. So before going into his special effects like Riptide, I will do a review on his skills first, and just to show you how they work and where his damage stands compared to other 5-star characters. So in his range stance, it's pretty standard. He has the normal attack and charged attack. I will go over Riptide and how it works later because I actually compiled all the information that I have regarding Riptide and like how to apply and what you can do with Riptide. So we'll just go to the elemental skill for now. His elemental skill basically switches his stance to melee and converts his normal attacks into hydro damage in this stance. The most important warning here is that it does not persist when you swap characters, and you will revert back to range stance when you swap back. So anyway, before patch 1.1 was released, I read that his elemental skill had no cooldown, but that's not actually true. The longer that you stay in his melee stance, the longer this cooldown becomes. Therefore, this means that you can't actually freely switch between his stances. So there is a maximum duration of 30 seconds in his melee stance, and if you let it expire automatically, the cooldown becomes 45 seconds. However, if you press the skill to go back to range stance before it expires, the cooldown at maximum will be reduced to 36 seconds, so do not ever let it expire if you want to play him well. There will also be an indicator before it's about to expire, and you basically just have to press his elemental skill before the third indicator fades. Moving on to his burst, there are two variants of this. In range stance, using his burst will do damage in an AoE around your target, and it will also apply the Riptide debuff on all enemies hit, while also refunding 20 energy back to him. In melee stance, using his burst will do much more damage, and it will also deal additional damage if the enemy has the Riptide debuff, which is actually very easy to apply in melee stance. This Riptide blast damage does additional damage in an AoE, which is 120% at level 1, and yes, it stacks. What I mean by this is, okay, well, I'll just show you in this clip what it looks like when you use his burst on one enemy, and you can see that the Riptide blast triggers after the initial hit of his burst, and it only hits once. But later on in this clip, when I use it on multiple enemies with the Riptide debuff, they didn't just take one additional hit, they took a few each. So not only is it AoE, it can also trigger on each enemy, which makes his burst utterly broken in an AoE setting. So just for damage comparisons, against a single target, his melee stance does 464% base damage and another 120% if the enemy has the Riptide debuff, right? So that's a total of 584% damage. That's basically the same amount of damage percent as Deluxe Burst at level 1, with the Phoenix from Deluxe Burst hitting 3 times, which is honestly quite insane. Now I will talk about his special Riptide effect, and first I will explain how do you apply this debuff. The first method will be the Riptide Burst, and note that this is just the name of this effect. It is not actually related to your burst. So if you kill an enemy with the Riptide debuff, this Riptide Burst effect will basically spread the Riptide debuff to nearby enemies, and this actually works in both stances. The second and third way to cause Riptide is in his ranged stance, and you can either do a charge shot or use his burst in his ranged stance. The fully charged aim shot applies Riptide to only one enemy of course, but killing an enemy with the Riptide debuff or using his burst in ranged stance will apply Riptide to enemies in an area. The fourth way to apply Riptide is in his melee stance, and this only works when you have his second Ascension talent, which unlocks his level cap to 70, then only you can apply Riptide by doing critical hits in his melee stance. Note that this can apply Riptide to multiple enemies because his melee stance can actually hit more than one enemies at once. His second Ascension talent is actually worded wrongly, or rather it's misleading, and I'll actually go through that in the later parts of this video. So now I'll show you what you can do while you have the Riptide debuff on your enemies. In total, there are actually 4 things that you can do with the Riptide debuff. So first would be the Riptide burst that I mentioned earlier, which happens passively when you kill an enemy with the Riptide debuff, spreading the Riptide debuff onto nearby enemies. The second would be the Riptide flash, and basically this happens when you use a fully charged aim shot on the enemy with the Riptide debuff. This will basically do 3 small hits, and it's also AoE damage. So the third would be the Riptide Blast, which happens when you use your burst in melee stance to do more damage, while also removing the Riptide debuff on the enemies that you hit. And lastly, the fourth would be the Riptide Slash, and all you have to do is to just spam your normal attacks in melee stance on the enemy to do constant AoE hydro damage. So note that when you crit in his melee stance, this will also refresh the Riptide debuff on the enemies you hit, so you don't actually have to worry about the uptime in his melee stance. So looking at this clip, I believe that it can actually proc multiple times on different enemies. So this first clip shows one AoE proc, and this next clip will show multiple AoE procs, and you can practically see the huge damage difference between the 2 clips. His passive talents from ascending up to level 70 is actually quite straightforward, but the second one is actually quite misleading. Just to get this out of the way, the first Ascension talent extends the duration of Riptide by 8 seconds, which then totals up to 18 seconds. The second talent, as mentioned earlier, it says that if he's in his melee stance, or if his normal and charged attacks do crit damage, they will apply Riptide. So naturally, I read it as any attack in melee stance, and as for his ranged attack, I assumed that it just has to be a crit on his normal or charged attacks, but this is not actually the case. In this clip, you can see that when I crit with my bow, it does not apply the Riptide effect, but if I swap to my melee stance and do a crit, it will then apply the Riptide effect. So note that non-crits on his melee stance also doesn't work. As for his constellations, I will only be going through the first, second, fourth and last constellations because the third and fifth are always level upgrades. So his first constellation reduces the cooldown of his elemental skill by 20%, and honestly it's quite a QOL for him, but it's not exactly a game changer. The second constellation is basically another QOL, and I assume that it works the same way as Venti's energy refund, so he doesn't have to be the active character for this to work. So it's not exactly a must, but it does spare you from needing energy recharge from like his artifact substats. You could also just pair him with another Hydro user just to get more Hydro energy, so I don't really think this is necessary. The fourth constellation passively triggers Riptide Slash if you're in melee stance, and it also passively triggers Riptide Flash if you're in range stance. This is actually huge as a constellation because at max talent level, the Riptide Slash is probably going to do around at least 120% damage, I think. But the crazy thing here is that this triggers on every enemy affected by Riptide in combat, unless it's worded wrongly again. As for the last constellation, it's absolutely crazy as usual, otherwise how are you gonna justify spending thousands of dollars on him? So this gives him double the uptime on his melee stance, which is where most of the AoE hydro damage will come from. So that's all for this video, and I hope that it explains how Childe works. If you like such guides, do consider subbing, and anyway, I'm just trying to hit my first 1000 subscribers. So after this, I will be doing more Childe playthroughs. No, wait, I can't say that. I mean, more Childe's showcase of Childe's gameplay. I need to stop saying Childe.